There's a version of you a narcissist is terrified of, and it isn't the version who cries. It isn't the version who begs for an explanation, who spirals after a fight, who checks their phone every 4 minutes, wondering if this silence means something worse than the last one. That version, painful as it is to admit, was never actually a threat to them. That version kept them safe. That version kept them needed. The version they're actually afraid of is the one who's fine. If you've ever watched a narcissist grow strangely, almost irrationally agitated by your good days, your promotion, your new friendships, the moment you started laughing again after weeks of being quietly devastated by something they did, you already know this instinctively, even if you've never had the language to explain why it happens. Today, we're going to give you that language, because understanding exactly why your thriving destabilizes a narcissist more than your suffering ever could is one of the most powerful things you will ever learn about this dynamic, and it will change how you think about every version of healing out loud you've ever been tempted to hide. Let's start with the actual mechanics of what a narcissist needs from the people closest to them, because it's rarely what people assume. Most people think narcissists want their partner happy, at least on the surface, at least in the ways that reflect well on them publicly. That's true, but only in a very narrow, very specific sense. They want you to appear happy in a way that can be pointed to and displayed, while remaining privately, structurally dependent on their approval to sustain that happiness. What they do not want, what genuinely terrifies them at a level most of them couldn't articulate even under direct questioning, is a partner whose happiness doesn't route through them at all. This distinction is everything. A narcissist can tolerate, can even enjoy, a partner who is joyful because of them. That version of joy is controllable. It can be granted, withdrawn, rationed out as a reward for good behavior, withheld as punishment when you've stepped out of line. It keeps you oriented toward them, constantly checking your emotional temperature against their mood, your sense of security rising and falling with how pleased they seem to be with you on any given day. This is, functionally, one of the primary engines of a narcissistic relationship. Not cruelty for its own sake, but the careful, ongoing management of your emotional dependency, because a dependent partner is a controllable one. A thriving partner breaks this engine completely, not through defiance, not through confrontation, not through any dramatic gesture at all, simply through the quiet, undeniable fact of a happiness that no longer needs their permission to exist. Here's what makes this so uniquely threatening. More threatening than almost anything you could say to them directly in an argument. It removes the leverage entirely. Every narcissistic relationship runs underneath the surface on a kind of ledger, a system of rewards and withdrawals designed to keep you oriented toward earning their approval. When you're thriving independently of them, that ledger stops mattering. You're no longer checking the balance before deciding how you feel about yourself. And a person whose sense of security doesn't depend on being kept in a particular emotional state is a person who can no longer be effectively managed through that state. This is why so many narcissists respond to their partner's genuine growth not with pride, not with the support a healthy partner would offer, but with something that looks almost like grief mixed with panic. You'll notice it in small, telling moments, a compliment from a friend at dinner that gets subtly undercut moments later. A new hobby you've thrown yourself into that suddenly becomes taking too much time away from the relationship. A promotion at work that should be celebrated instead gets met with a strange, deflating comment about how things are going to change now, or you're going to think you're too good for this. None of these reactions make sense if you assume the narcissist simply wants you happy. They make perfect sense the moment you understand what they're actually protecting. Not your happiness, but their access to it. And here's the deeper layer underneath all of this, the one that explains why this dynamic runs so much deeper than simple jealousy or insecurity, though it often gets mistaken for both. A narcissist's sense of self, as we've talked about before, is built almost entirely from the outside in, dependent on external admiration, external validation, a constant stream of reflection from other people that tells them who they are, because they've never developed a stable, internally generated sense of identity that could tell them on its own. This means the people closest to them aren't just partners in the ordinary sense. They're mirrors, load-bearing structural elements in an identity that would otherwise have nothing solid underneath it. A partner who is struggling, who is anxious, who is emotionally dependent on the narcissist's approval makes an excellent mirror. Their mood can be shaped, their attention can be commanded, their sense of self can be subtly aligned with whatever the narcissist needs reflected back at any given moment. A partner who is thriving, confident, secure, drawing strength from sources entirely outside the relationship, makes a terrible mirror because a stable, independent person doesn't bend their reflection to match someone else's need. They simply reflect what's actually there. And for a narcissist, being shown an accurate reflection, rather than a flattering, carefully managed one, is one of the most destabilizing experiences that exists. This is the real reason your thriving feels to them less like good news and more like a threat. And once that realization becomes even remotely possible, everything about how they've been operating starts to feel to them dangerously unstable, which is exactly why the response to your thriving so rarely looks like celebration and so often looks like a subtle, persistent campaign to bring you back down to a size they can manage again. This campaign almost never announces itself as sabotage because if it did, it would be too easy to recognize and resist. Instead, it arrives disguised as concern, as humor, as offhand observations that seem almost too small to argue with. I just don't want you to burn out. You've been so busy lately, we barely talk anymore. I liked you better before you got so serious about all this. Each one, taken individually, could plausibly be innocent. Taken together as a pattern, they form something much clearer, a consistent, low-grade pressure aimed at making your growth feel costly, inconvenient, even a little bit selfish, so that some part of you starts quietly negotiating your own ambition down in exchange for peace at home. This is one of the cruelest mechanisms in the entire dynamic because it recruits your own empathy against you. You're not being told to stop growing directly. That would be too obvious, too easy to refuse outright. You're being shown subtly and repeatedly that your growth is costing the relationship something. And because you care about the relationship, because you're the kind of person who takes relational costs seriously, you start making adjustments. You take the promotion but downplay it at home. You keep the new friendship but stop mentioning it as often because every time you do, something in the room gets a little colder. You shrink the space your thriving takes up. Not because you've been ordered to, but because you've been trained, gradually, to associate your own expansion with someone else's contraction. Here's what's happening underneath that dynamic, and it's worth naming clearly, because it exposes exactly how fragile the whole system actually is. A narcissist cannot tolerate watching you build a source of stability they don't control. This is true whether that source is a job, a friend group, a creative pursuit, therapy, a renewed relationship with your own family, anything at all that gives you a sense of worth that doesn't run through them first. Because the moment you have that, the central mechanism of the relationship, your dependency on their approval, starts to weaken. And a relationship built primarily on that mechanism doesn't have much else holding it together underneath. This is why so many people describe a strange, disorienting pattern in hindsight. The narcissist was, in some ways, more attentive, more affectionate, more engaged during the hardest periods of the relationship than during the good ones. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't evidence that they secretly love conflict for its own sake. It's evidence that your distress, your uncertainty, your emotional dependence on them for reassurance was functionally the thing keeping the relationship running the way they needed it to run. Your suffering gave them a job. Your thriving takes that job away. And here's the part that explains why some narcissists escalate dramatically the moment real, lasting stability starts to take root in your life. Why the fights sometimes get worse right when things should logically be getting easier. Why an affair or a sudden betrayal sometimes surfaces at the exact moment you've finally found your footing after a long period of struggle. This isn't random timing. It's often whether consciously calculated or not, a desperate attempt to reintroduce chaos into a system that has started to stabilize without their help. Chaos is disorienting. Chaos requires your full attention. Chaos, most importantly, gives them something to manage again, something to be needed for, a crisis around which the relationship can reorganize itself back into the shape they're used to controlling. This is one of the most important things to understand if you're currently in the process of rebuilding yourself after loving a narcissist, or if you're still inside a relationship and starting to notice this exact pattern taking shape. The sabotage, when it comes, is not proof that you did something wrong. It is proof, almost the opposite, that you did something right. You got strong enough, stable enough, independently resourced enough that the old mechanism stopped working the way it used to. And rather than adapt to a healthier, more equal dynamic, the narcissist reached for the only tool they've ever really had: destabilization, deployed specifically at the moment your stability became undeniable. Some empaths, recognizing this pattern for the first time, feel a strange, guilty instinct to apologize for their own growth, to soften it, minimize it, present it in a way that won't threaten the relationship quite so much. I want to be very direct about this because it's one of the most important things in this entire story. That instinct, however understandable, however deeply conditioned, is exactly the mechanism this dynamic depends on to keep functioning. Your thriving was never the thing that needed to be managed. Their inability to tolerate it was. And this is where the real turning point in this story lives, not in some dramatic confrontation, not in a perfectly worded explanation that finally makes them understand, but in the quiet, private decision to stop shrinking your own life down to a size that keeps someone else comfortable, regardless of whether they ever come to terms with that decision at all. Because here's the truth, this entire pattern has been circling from the very beginning, the one that changes everything once you actually let yourself believe it. Your thriving was never yours to apologize for. It never needed their permission, their comfort, or their approval to be valid. And the moment you stop offering all three, something remarkable happens, not necessarily to them, because you cannot control whether they ever grow capable of celebrating someone else's success without experiencing it as a threat. Something remarkable happens to you, because once you stop shrinking, once you stop preemptively softening your wins, downplaying your joy, editing your own life down to a size that keeps someone else's fragile equilibrium intact, you start to notice something you may not have had access to in a very long time: the full, unfiltered shape of who you actually are when you're not constantly managing someone else's reaction to your existence. This is not a small thing. For many empaths who've spent years in relationships like this, it is the first time in a long time that their success feels entirely, uncomplicatedly theirs. Not something to be quietly proud of and loudly minimized in the same breath, but something they're finally allowed to simply have. This is also, without question, one of the most reliable signs that a relationship has become fundamentally incompatible with your growth, whether or not either of you ever names it that directly. A healthy partner, watching you build a life that includes sources of joy and stability outside the relationship, feels expansion alongside you, genuine pride, genuine excitement, a sense that your strength adds to what the two of you share rather than threatening it. If the person across from you consistently, reliably responds to your good news with subtle deflation, with backhanded concern, with a mood that curdles the moment your life starts working without their involvement, that reaction is information. It's telling you clearly and repeatedly exactly what kind of relationship you're actually in, regardless of what it's being called. And here's what I want you to sit with. If you're recognizing this pattern in your own life right now, whether you're still inside that relationship or already standing outside its wreckage, trying to make sense of what happened, the version of you a narcissist fears most is not a version you need to hide, minimize, or apologize for having become. It's not a threat because it's cruel or vindictive or designed to punish anyone. It's a threat because it's simply, quietly, undeniably whole. A person whose worth doesn't require anyone's ongoing approval to keep existing, whose joy doesn't need permission, whose stability doesn't depend on someone else's mood in order to hold. That wholeness was never something you built to threaten them. You built it to survive. You built it because some part of you understood long before you had the language to explain why, that a life spent shrinking to keep someone else comfortable was never actually a life at all. Just a long, quiet negotiation for scraps of approval from someone who was never going to offer you anything close to what you actually deserved. If you're on the other side of that negotiation now, if you've left, or you're in the slow, difficult process of leaving, or you're simply starting for the first time to let your own thriving take up space without immediately checking to see how it landed on someone else's face, understand this clearly. You are not required to make your growth smaller so that someone else's fragility feels safer. You are never responsible for managing the threat your own wholeness poses to a person who never learned how to build any of their own. Let your life get loud. Let your joy take up the entire room. Let the promotion, the new friendships, the mornings you wake up without dread sitting in your chest exist exactly as large as they actually are without shrinking a single one of them down to a size that keeps anyone else comfortable. Because a thriving you was never their biggest threat by accident. It was their biggest threat because it was, this entire time, the truest, most undeniable proof that you were never the problem they always needed you to believe you were.